Hello, welcome back to my channel. It is lovely to have you here. My name is Grace, and in April I read the most books I have ever read in 1 month. Now, granted, this was only 6 books, which I know is not a lot for everyone, but for me that is a huge amount in 1 month, so I am really pleased with myself, and I'm gonna take the opportunity while I can to make a monthly wrap-up for the first time. I don't know if this will be a common thing for me. I don't know if I'll be able to read this much every month or if I'll end up doing kind of bi-monthly wrap-ups, but for now, here's all the books that I read in April, plus 1 extra. We're actually going to start with a bonus book that I read towards the end of March because I didn't mention it in my last wrap-up, which was more of a everything I'd read so far this year wrap-up, but I don't want to not mention it in any wrap-up, so I'm gonna add it on here, and that is The Prisoner's Throne by Holly Black. This is the sequel and final installment in the duology that began with The Stolen Heir, and this is a duology that's set in the same world as The Cruel Prince but comes several years down the line from the ending of that trilogy. Now, I devoured the Cruel Prince series at the end of last year. I found the political intrigue so compelling, and the way that Holly Black writes fae is my favourite kind of fae, when they actually are monstrous and terrifying instead of just hot. That's my preferred version of fae, and I was both nervous and excited to go into this duology after the original trilogy because I didn't know if it could live up to the originals, and honestly I don't think it did, at least not for me. I really enjoyed the first book in the duology, The Stolen Heir. I think because it was quite different to the first trilogy, it didn't feel like it was just trying to replicate the same vibes. It was a lot more of a quest story, the characters were very different, so I didn't feel like I was just comparing it to The Cruel Prince the whole time. Whereas this second book in the duology was a lot more heavy on the political intrigue, which I love normally. And don't get me wrong, I did enjoy this book. It wasn't bad by any means, but I think I was comparing it internally to The Cruel Prince, and it didn't hit quite the same for me. I'm not going to go into too much detail because obviously it is the last in a second series in a world, so I can't really explain anything without spoilers. But the point of view shifts between the first and second book in this duology. There are 2 main characters, and the first book is from one of their perspectives and the second book is from the other perspective. And the way that the second book worked out meant that we didn't spend as much time at all with the first perspective main character, so it was quite jarring to go from being in her head and seeing from her perspective to not seeing her very much at all and not really understanding what she was thinking and feeling in any given moment. And that was the point of the book. A lot of the narrative came from the 2 characters trying to understand each other, but I really missed that character. I really liked her, and I think that I was less invested in that second half of the duology because we saw a lot less of her. So I have mixed feelings about this one. I didn't dislike it at all. I had a fun time, and I definitely will be reading other books by Holly Black in the future, but it didn't quite hit the way that I wanted it to as the final installment of that duology. But I would still say if you enjoyed The Cruel Prince as a series, give this one a go. It's fun to see from a different perspective, and also you do get quite a lot, especially in the second book of the duology, you get a lot of content from the characters from the Cruel Prince trilogy. So if you want to see the original characters again and you're hungering for more of them, then you will get that here. And if you've not read any Holly Black at all, I would highly recommend definitely start with the Cruel Prince. Do not jump to this series. Definitely read the Cruel Prince. It's really good. But that is The Prisoner's Throne by Holly Black. Okay, on to the first book that I actually read in May, which was Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki and Rosemary Valero-O'Connell. This is a graphic novel about a girl in a toxic sapphic relationship and the way that this impacts her behaviour towards her friends and the people around her, and why she stays in that relationship for as long as she does. Honestly, from the cover, I thought this would be a lot more light-hearted and cozy than it was. This explored some reasonably heavy themes. I definitely recommend looking up trigger warnings before you go into this one. And the main character was not hugely likable. which she wasn't really meant to be, I don't think, because of what she was going through. She was really taking that out on the people around her and being quite selfish. But I think this was done to explore the way that a toxic relationship can really impact who you are as a person and turn you into someone that you might not want to be. And I really enjoyed that at least most of the side characters in this one felt like they were their own person. They weren't just there to further the main character's story or the relationship. The focus was spread quite evenly between the characters. This wasn't a groundbreaking read for me, but I would recommend it. I read it in one sitting and I think it was an interesting look at toxic relationships, especially within a queer space. So that is Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me. Next up, I read, I think, my second non-fiction book of the year, which was Enchantment by Katherine May. I didn't love this. I'm not really sure what genre this was. It was somewhere between a self-help book, a nature writing book, and a memoir. This explored the author's issues through lockdown with feeling disenchanted by the world and trying to find that feeling again, often through rediscovering parts of nature that they might have lost during that time, or other things like reading, trying to get back into that. Now, I am really not a self-help girly myself. I've never actively chosen to read one, and I generally feel quite pessimistic about self-help books. But at the same time, part of me wishes this book had been more self-helpy. It felt a lot more like we were kind of getting dragged along for the ride with these small details about this person's life that I wasn't really that invested in, unfortunately, when what I really wanted was to learn a bit about how I could re-enchant myself with life. One of the things that I personally turn to when my mental health is feeling a bit rough is nature. It is a big part of the joy that I find in the world, and I thought that this book would be a lot more helpful in teaching you how to reacquaint yourself with that. But really we were just kind of following the author's experiences and the specific things that they cared about, which just didn't really align for me. I just don't think that I really learned anything from this book. There were moments where it was pretty writing-wise and I felt like I could relate to what the author was feeling, but I didn't really take anything away from this book that I'm gonna remember, that's gonna stick with me. I've honestly already forgotten most of what this book was about. So unfortunately didn't quite hit for me, but that was Enchantment by Katherine May. The next book that I read this month was recommended to me by my boyfriend's sister, and I was a little bit nervous to read it because it is historical fiction, which is usually quite out of my comfort zone. So this is The Illumination of Ursula Flight by Marie-Crowhurst. This is the story of Ursula Flight, a girl living in 1600s England who wants to become a playwright. But of course society wants her to get married instead and just be a wife. This book definitely wasn't what I expected it to be. It wasn't quite as involved with the world of theatre as I thought it would be based on the blurb. It is in there and it's definitely the main character's biggest passion, but she spends a lot of time not quite reaching that goal during this book, so I wouldn't go into this expecting it to all be set in that theatre world. This for me was one of those stories that I adore personally, where you kind of just follow a person's life from event to event in that jumbled way that life goes, rather than it having the classic plot structure. And I know that doesn't work for everyone, but for me, I love that. I eat that up. This was also just written so interestingly. It's very multi-format in a way, in that some of it is written as straight up prose, but then you'll often have a chapter that's just a list or letters or even a table comparing things, or there are several in here which are scripts, and they are events that are taking place in Ursula's life, but they're written as if she is writing them, and she gets little moments of asides where she turns off to the audience to make a comment about someone's behaviour. And it was so refreshing. The way that this was written felt so ingenious to me and inspiring as a writer myself. It really made me think about the way that I write and the barriers that I might have put up for myself, which don't necessarily need to be there, because the thing that I enjoyed so much about this book was that it broke rules in the way that it was written. I will say again, if you are interested in reading this one, I would look up the trigger warnings because there are some dark moments in here. I mean, it's a girl in the 1600s being forced to marry a much older man. Already pretty grim, so you can imagine there are some things in here that might not be suitable for everyone. So I would definitely check out to see if this is something you would be comfortable reading, but this definitely has sparked my interest in reading more historical fiction in the future. So that is The Illumination of Ursula Flight by Marie-Crowhurst. After that, I was craving some more historical fiction, but I wanted a little bit of fantasy dropped in there, so I went for Mortal Follies by Alexis Hall. This is a story set in the early 1800s, also in England, about a debutante who seems to be cursed, who ends up seeking the assistance of another woman who society has decided must be a witch because her father and brothers died in quick succession, leaving her entitled to her family's fortune. This was one of those settings that I really enjoy, where it is set in our world, but a version of it in which fae are known to exist, as well as gods. There's magic woven into this historical setting. This is narrated by a hobgoblin who was also Lord Oberon's jester, and the narration is a very over way, as in they will give inputs to the story and explain why they followed this part of the narrative instead of following another character to find out what they were doing. So they are, in a way, a character themselves within this story. And I found that really interesting. I've heard some reviews of this say that they didn't like that, and I can understand why you might not. I think there were moments where it was a little bit overdone. A lot of the time, if that narrator gave a little bit of input, it could be funny and witty, but sometimes they would just do it a little bit too much and it would break into the scene and take you out of it for a moment. But I think a lot of that comes down to personal taste. I think some people would love this narration style and some people would really not vibe with it at all, and some people would be in the middle, kind of like me. The plot itself was a little bit strange here. I think pacing wise I wasn't too sure about it because the initial issue that we're trying to solve doesn't really last for the whole book. I don't want to give too much away in case you do want to read this, but we kind of jump from problem to problem a little bit, meaning that the overall arc felt like it lost momentum at moments to me. There is a sapphic romance in here, which I did enjoy. It didn't always go the way that I expected it to, and the way that the two characters interacted was a little bit like a battle at times of wills, because they were both quite strong characters in different ways. This was an interesting one. I did enjoy the risks that it took in the writing style. I don't know if this book will stay with me for too long, but I'd recommend giving it a go. It was good fun if you enjoy historical sapphic romance with a snarky narrator in there. Mortal Follies by Alexis Hall. The next book that I read this month was one that's been on my TBR for many years now, and that is Out of Love by Hazel Hayes. This was a bit of a strange one for me because I had quite a lot of context going into this. Hazel Hayes is a YouTuber that I used to watch a lot of content from when I was a teenager, and she very much used to share a lot of her life online in vlogs. So I got this book because I like her as a person and her content, and I've been meaning to read it for years. It's just been sitting on my shelf, I think because I knew it was going to be sad and I was scared. This is a love story told in reverse from the point of the couple breaking up back in time to the point that they met, which is a really interesting concept, I think, because obviously you know what's going to happen, there's no suspense in that sense, but it leaves room for a lot of emotional impact because you're reading these warm, fluffy scenes of this couple getting together, knowing that it doesn't work out. The strange thing about this book for me was that there were a lot of parallels between what happened in here and what I know of the author's life, to the point of specific conversations and interactions and events in here being things that I remember she said happened to her at some point. Obviously with all the names changed, and there are lots of other events in here that I don't know if they were real or not. But to me, that meant that this read a lot more like a memoir than a novel. And it's very hard for me to tell if that experience would be different if you went into this without any context and without knowing the author beforehand. It also might have been exacerbated by the fact that I listened to this as an audiobook and Hazel narrated it. So it was very much read in her voice as if she was telling her own story. That didn't take away from the enjoyment of this for me, but I think that I enjoyed it a lot more once I started to look at it as if it was a memoir rather than a novel. To me at least, the way that this was written felt a lot more like a memoir, in that the main character would sometimes go off on tangents about things that they'd learned or their mental health in a way that a book character wouldn't, I don't think, or it wouldn't sit right in the same way within a novel. I would definitely recommend that you give this one a read if you like romance, but you can deal with a sad ending, because you very much know that that's what you're going to get when you go into this book. I think there were moments of really interesting nuance in here, and the way that the relationship is explored as neither party being perfect or evil. Both of them are flawed, both of them make mistakes and aren't there for each other in moments where they could be, but at the same time there are moments of joy and real happiness and connection between the two of them, and you can see that complexity of the relationship and the way that it breaks down. I'd be really interested to see what the opinion of someone who didn't know Hazel Hayes before going into this book might be, and to see if they took it in quite differently. I don't know if maybe I cared more because I kind of knew who this was about, but I would recommend this one. And if you're an audiobook person, Hazel does read this really well with her lovely Irish accent. So that is Out of Love by Hazel Hayes. We are now on to the last book that I read this month, which I was really excited for. It was on my 24 books in 2024 that I wanted to read, and it's about all of my favourite things in theory, and that is Sisters of Sword and Shadow by Laura Bates. This was marketed to me as, what if we had Arthurian knights, but they were all women? And I was so excited because that is 100% my vibe. Women in suits of armour, give it to me. This is a young adult fantasy novel, the first fantasy novel written by Laura Bates, who usually writes feminist non-fiction. I think that they have written a fiction book before, but it definitely wasn't fantasy. And you could tell this book frustrated me. There were so many elements of this book that could have been good, but there was no follow through. The main character, Cass, is taken away by a mysterious knight who she later finds out is a woman, to a group of female knights who are hiding their identity but at the same time looking for glory and a safe space to call their own and have a found family. Cass always assumed she would just get married and live in her little village for the rest of her life, but she always wanted more. And I think one of the things that just didn't work about this for me is that she gets more straight away. She immediately ends up in this group of incredible women who are kicking ass with their swords every day, and it's all she ever really wanted. Sure, there is some internal conflict there because she left her family behind, but it's not enough to really drive this book. You don't really feel like there's any impetus here moving the plot forward. And when I say plot, what plot? The characters deal with challenges as and when they show up, but there's no real through line in this story of something we're aiming towards, other than getting better at fighting, I guess. Also, a lot of the relationships in here just didn't make any sense to me. There are some that work. The main character has one best friend who I really did like, and I really liked their relationship and how close they were. It really seemed to portray that female bond that can be so strong. But at the same time, there were relationships that had loads of build-up as if they were going to be really important, and then just dropped off into basically nothingness in the rest of the book, and vice versa. There were relationships that seemed to have no build-up at all, but then suddenly were important. The writing itself in here wasn't bad, but the actual structure of any plot line or any character development just didn't make any sense to me, and I didn't know where we were going with this. There's also an overarching prophecy going on where right at the beginning of this book, Cass as a child has a strange encounter with someone in the woods where they imply that she is important for some reason. And this is mentioned on and off throughout the book as if it's going to be a really big thing. And I'm not going to tell you what happens, but it just didn't work for me. The follow through on so many arcs in here just wasn't there for me. So this was a big letdown, I'm not gonna lie. I really don't like being this negative about a book, but oh man, it got on my nerves. It's also so gorgeous and I'm so sad because I don't think I want to keep this anymore. If you have any books that you've read that have the vibes of what this could have been but worked better, please hit me up because I want to read this genre. I want to read about women in suits of armor. That's all I want. I just had such high hopes and this did not meet them, unfortunately. That is Sisters of Sword and Shadow by Laura Bates. So that is all of the books that I read in April. It was a strange month. Several disappointments, unfortunately, and I would say my favourite book by far was The Illumination of Ursula Flight, which in contrast I didn't expect to love as much as I did. Here's to hopefully a much better reading month in May. Please let me know what you've been reading in April. I would love to hear what your favourite book was this past month, and if you want to be a hater, let me know what your least favourite book was as well. But I really do hope you had a better reading month than I did. But anyway, thank you very much for watching and listening to me rant. I really appreciate you being here as always, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye bye.